My name is Hannah Brooks. I'm 29 years old, and 2 days before my wedding, my parents gave me an ultimatum right there in the church dressing room, amidst the bulb-lit mirrors and the smell of hairspray. Take him off the guest list, my father said quietly, but with the tone of a judge pronouncing a sentence. Or he won't come. And neither will we. He didn't say a name. He didn't need to. My grandfather, Walter Brooks. The man who raised me. The man my family had decided to hide away. Back then, I didn't know that 48 hours later, the entire room would rise to their feet. Not because of my wedding dance, but because of him. And because of the man my father was so desperately trying to impress. If you've ever felt like you were being asked to choose between love and approval, stay with me. Because this isn't a story about a wedding. It's about the price people pay to look right. And about the moment someone finally stops playing by those rules. I didn't grow up in the house my parents lived in. I grew up in a small house in Dayton with creaky stairs, where the coffee was always strong and the rules were simple. My grandfather woke up at 5 in the morning. He cooked breakfast, fixed whatever was broken, and worked as a janitor at a school. He never complained. He never made excuses. He just did the work. Leave everything better than you found it, he used to say. I heard it so often that I stopped noticing it. Like breathing. Like silence. My parents visited rarely, but when they did, it was in style. They always looked like people from a different world. My father in shirts that were ironed even on weekends. My mother with a perfect smile she turned on like a light switch. They weren't cruel. No, they were worse. They were evaluators. Every conversation was a report. Every achievement, a score. When I told my father I had become a postal worker, he asked, "And are you really planning to be proud of that?" He didn't yell. He just made me feel smaller. And then he moved on. But the strangest thing was how he treated my grandfather. He didn't argue with him. He just acted like he didn't exist. No invitations, no mentions, no place at the table. It was as if my grandfather were an error on a document that was easier to delete. I asked him once, "Why don't you invite him?" My father didn't even look at me. Some worlds aren't meant to cross. I didn't understand then, but soon I understood all too well. When Ethan proposed, everything felt simple, honest, and real. He stood along my delivery route holding a little box, wearing a nervous smile. I said yes before he could even finish. We wanted a small wedding. Family, warmth, and my grandfather by my side. That was the only thing I was absolutely sure about. Then came the dinner, and the $30,000 check. "To make sure everything looks right," my father said. "It's an investment," my mother added. I should have refused, but I didn't. I had spent my whole life smoothing things over for them, and I thought I could do it one more time. I was wrong. Within a week, my wedding ceased to be mine. The music was wrong, the flowers were wrong, the guests weren't mine. And then I saw the seating chart. I found my grandfather, table number 14, by the kitchen door, behind a pillar, where no one could see him. I felt something quietly break inside me. "He is sitting at the main table," I told my mother. She sighed. "Hannah, that's just not practical." Practical. I wrote that word down so I would never forget what betrayal sounds like when it's given a different name. My grandfather didn't argue. "I've sat in worse places," he said, as if we were talking about a chair and not his place in my life. Everything changed the evening I realized it wasn't about the table. It was about fear. A story from my father's childhood. A boy. A tray. A rag. Laughter. "Your dad isn't very good at cleaning." Ever since then, my father erased everything from his life that reminded him of that moment. Even his own father. During the week leading up to the wedding, the pressure became unbearable. Phone calls, messages, arguments. Don't ruin his chance. It's just one evening. Think about the future. Everyone told me I had to give in. Slowly, I began to believe that I was the problem. Until one thing changed everything. My mother called Ethan's parents to adjust their behavior. In that moment, I realized this wasn't a compromise. This was a takeover. That night, I went through all the documents and found the only thing that truly belonged to me. The venue. Marigold Hall. Signed by me. Paid for by me. I realized I still had a choice. The day before the wedding, I made up my mind. I didn't tell anyone, not even Ethan, at least not entirely, because I knew if I did, they would try to talk me out of it again. The rehearsal went perfectly. Too perfectly. My father was beaming, my mother was in full control, and the guests were smiling. My grandfather stood off to the side in his suit and polished shoes. I saw him adjust his cuffs the exact same way my father did, and for the first time, I realized they were much more alike than they thought. Wedding day. 200 guests, music, lights, and my father who was already mentally sitting in a new executive chair at his office. Standing next to him was the man this whole circus was arranged for, Raymond Whitfield, the CEO. The man himself. The ceremony was beautiful, flawless, and cold. Because the most important person wasn't where he belonged. Then the reception started, and that's when everything went off script. I stood up, picked up the microphone, and said, "Before we begin, I want to fix something." Silence fell over the room. My father froze. My mother turned pale. I looked across the hall, then at table 14. There is a person here who shouldn't be sitting where he is, and I want to change that, right now. I stepped down from the stage, walked across the room, approached my grandfather, and held out my hand. "Come with me." He looked at me for a long moment as if checking whether I was sure. I was. By the time we reached the head table, whisperings were echoing through the room. My father stood up. "Hannah, not now." I looked at him. "Right now." I seated my grandfather right next to me, in my spot. And in that exact moment, something nobody expected happened. Raymond Whitfield stood up slowly, set his glass down, buttoned his jacket, and walked across the hall, straight toward us. I heard someone whisper, "What's going on?" He walked up, looked at my grandfather, and smiled. "Walter Brooks?" My grandfather frowned. "Do we know each other?" And then the entire room heard the words that turned everything upside down. "You saved my company once." The silence became absolute. My father turned pale. "I'm sorry?" Raymond turned to him. "You didn't know?" He looked back at my grandfather. 30 years ago, when Harlan Trucking was on the brink of bankruptcy, you recalculated our routes, restructured our logistics, and cut our losses by 20%. I remembered the old photograph, the pencils, the blueprints. "I was a young manager back then," Raymond continued, "and I still remember the man who did the work that no one else got credit for." He paused. "Because he was listed as a janitor." The hall was dead silent. My father didn't move at all. "Meridian bought Harlan 5 years later," Raymond said, "and all of our current routes are still based on those exact blueprints." He looked straight at my father. "Including the ones you receive your bonuses for." I heard someone drop a fork. "Why did you never tell anyone?" I whispered to my grandfather. He shrugged. "Work is work." Those exact same words. Raymond raised his glass. "To the man who did more than most of us ever will." The entire room stood up, except my father. He stood there paralyzed, for the first time in his life not knowing where to put himself. That evening, everything changed. Not because of me, but because of the truth that had finally come to light. A week later, my father called. After a long silence, he said, "I didn't know." I answered honestly, "You didn't want to know." He didn't argue. My grandfather stayed the same. He still woke up at 5, fixed doors, and spoke in simple truths. But now, whenever he walked into a room, people stood up, not just because they knew who he was, but because they finally saw him. As for me, I did dance that wedding dance, but not with the person I had originally planned to. And to be honest, it was the only right choice I made through the entire wedding. After the wedding, silence set in. Not a calm, gentle silence where you can catch your breath, but a tense one, stretched like a wire ready to snap at the slightest careless word. Ethan and I came home late that night. I kicked off my shoes by the door and, for the first time all day, felt just how exhausted I was. Not physically, but deeper down. "Are you okay?" he asked. I nodded, then shook my head. "I don't know." He didn't push. He just sat down beside me. "You did the right thing." I looked at him. "What if it broke everything?" He thought for a second. "Then maybe it was meant to break." The next morning, my phone was silent. Not a single message from my parents. There were others, though. "Aunt Laura, so proud of you." "Cousin Mark." Finally someone said it. Even people I barely knew wrote to me, but nothing from my parents. And strangely, that was the loudest silence of all. My grandfather called himself. "Are you home?" "Yes. I brought you breakfast." Of course he did. He stood on the porch holding a bag, wearing that same expression, as if nothing out of the ordinary had happened. We ate in the kitchen. I looked at him, still struggling to wrap my head around what I had heard at the wedding. "Why didn't you ever really tell anyone?" He shrugged. "Nobody asked." I asked. He smiled. You asked about life. I told you about life. And that was who he was. No grand speeches, no trying to impress anyone, just facts. A few days later, things began to shift, cautiously at first, as if testing whether it was safe. My father called again. This time, the conversation was longer. I want to meet up, he said. With me or with Grandpa? A pause. With both of you. I didn't answer right away. It wasn't just an invitation. It was an admission, however belated. I'll think about it, I said. That same evening, Raymond Whitfield called. At first, I thought it was a mistake, but no. Hannah, this is Raymond. I hope I'm not interrupting. I almost laughed at the absurdity. A little bit. He chuckled. Fair enough. He spoke calmly, without pretension. I'd like to meet with your grandfather. Officially, there are things that ought to be said, properly. He doesn't like formality. Then informally, but with respect. I looked at my grandfather, who was fixing a cabinet handle at that very moment. I'll pass it along. When I told him, he initially waved it off. What's all this for? Because you deserve it. He looked at me intently. And what about you? What about me? Are you doing this for me or for yourself? I thought about it and answered honestly. For us. He nodded. Then let's go. The meeting took place in a small office at Meridian. No press, no fuss, just a few people. Raymond shook my grandfather's hand again, holding it longer this time. I've waited 30 years for this conversation. My grandfather smiled faintly. You should have just called. They both laughed, and the tension dissolved. They talked about work, about those old blueprints, about the decisions my grandfather had made back then. I listened, seeing him in a new light for the first time, not just as the man who raised me, but as someone who had once quietly reshaped something much bigger, and then simply moved on without expecting applause. A couple of weeks later, another unexpected thing happened. Meridian offered my grandfather an advisory role. Part-time, flexible hours, good pay. I was afraid he would refuse, but he agreed under one condition: no fancy titles. Whatever you say, Raymond smiled. My father showed up to one of those meetings too, awkward, reserved. He stood off to the side for a long time before approaching. Dad. The word sounded unnatural, heavy. My grandfather looked at him. Haven't heard that in a while. My father nodded. I was wrong. Simple, without excuses. And perhaps for the first time, genuine. My grandfather didn't answer right away. Then he said, You were so busy trying to prove you weren't me. A pause. And I never asked you to be me. It wasn't a dramatic movie moment, but something shifted inside it. Just a little, but enough. Things didn't become perfect overnight, nor did it happen quickly. We didn't suddenly start having Sunday dinners together or talking about our feelings like in the movies. But the main thing was gone. The pretense-filled silence was no more. I started noticing a subtle change at work too. People treated me differently, with respect, interest, curiosity. At first it annoyed me because it wasn't really about me, but then I realized it was still about making a choice, about the moment you stand up and say, enough. People notice that. Once I asked my grandfather, did you ever regret it? Regret what? That you weren't recognized back then. He thought for a moment. No. Really? If I had been recognized, I might have turned into a different person. A worse person? He smiled. Just different. And I like who I turned out to be. In that moment, I realized the wedding was never the main story. The main story was what happened afterward, when no one was watching, when there was no music playing, when you had to live with the consequences and make choices again and again. 6 months passed. We gathered at my grandfather's house for a small dinner, no special occasion. My father came, sat at the table almost entirely at ease. My mother still kept her distance, but she showed up, and that was a step in itself. At one point, my grandfather stood up to pour coffee. I heard my father say softly, I remember when you taught me how to hold a hammer. My grandfather stopped. You were terrible at it, my father chuckled. I know. A pause. But you put up with it anyway. Because you're my son. Those words carried more weight than any apology ever could. Later, as everyone was leaving, I stayed behind to help clean up, as I always did. My grandfather looked at me. Leave everything better than you found it. I smiled. I'm trying. He nodded. I can see that. Sometimes change looks loud, like that moment at the wedding with the microphone, the crowd, and the truth spoken out loud. But more often it happens quietly. In kitchen conversations, in awkward pauses, in words that couldn't be said before, and in someone finally deciding to stop hiding what matters, even if it's uncomfortable, even if it shatters the familiar. Because sometimes, to put things where they belong, you first have to flip the entire table. And offer no apologies for it. A year passed. There were no grand declarations about a family reunion, no picture-perfect commercial dinners, no sudden moment where everything went back to how it used to be. Because how it used to be no longer existed. And honestly, it was for the best. I stood in the exact same spot where I had held the microphone a year ago. Marigold Hall was decorated again, but this time simpler, warmer, and more real. "Are you sure you want to celebrate our anniversary here?" Ethan asked. I nodded. "Yes, because this is where everything truly began." He smiled. "Or ended. Sometimes they're the same thing." The guests arrived slowly, but today they were a different group. The ones who stayed, the ones who accepted us, the ones who didn't demand that I be convenient. My grandfather was among the first to arrive, wearing the same suit and polished shoes. But now he didn't search for a place to sit. He simply sat wherever he wanted, and no one would have dared suggest otherwise. My father arrived later. He stopped at the entrance, scanned the room, lingered his gaze on the head table and then on my grandfather. Then he made a choice. He walked up to him first. "Hey, Dad." It sounded easier now. My grandfather nodded. "You're not late." I tried not to be. And it was true. He really had been trying all year. Not perfectly, sometimes awkwardly, sometimes too late, but genuinely. And that turned out to be far more important than perfection. My mother walked in quietly, as if still checking whether there was a place for her here. I approached her myself. "I'm glad you came." She looked at me closely. "I'm learning." I nodded. "I see that." And that was true too. At one point, everyone was seated. Conversations flowed easily, and laughter came more often. I noticed my father explaining something to my grandfather, and for the first time not talking down to him but speaking as equals. And my grandfather listened, not defensively, just listening. I picked up the microphone again, but this time, my hands didn't shake. A year ago, I said I wanted to fix something. A light laugh rippled through the hall, and I think I flipped the whole table over back then. A few nods, a few smiles. I used to think the hardest part was speaking the truth out loud. I paused. Turns out it's not. The room grew attentive and quiet. The hardest part is living afterward, every single day, with the consequences, with new boundaries, with people who change, slowly. I looked at my parents, or don't change at all. Then I looked at my grandfather, and with the people who were real all along. I took a deep breath. I thought a lot about how to end this story, but I don't think it has a classic ending, because this isn't a story about winning, and it isn't about losing. It's a story about making a choice, one you have to make over and over again. I stepped down from the stage and walked over to my grandfather. "Will you dance with me?" He chuckled. "I'm not much of a dancer." "I know. Then why are you asking?" I smiled. "Because it matters." He stood up and took my hand, just like he used to when I was little, when he taught me how to keep my balance, long before I knew that one day I would have to hold his. The music started softly, not perfectly chosen, not proper, but ours. We moved slowly, awkwardly, honestly. And then I noticed that people weren't watching with expectation. They were just watching, and they understood. I looked up and saw my father standing nearby, looking at us. There was no shame in his eyes, no urge to hide anything, only acceptance. He took a step forward. "May I?" My grandfather looked at him, then at me. "Careful," he said. "She leads." My father smiled faintly. I noticed. And for the first time in my entire life, they weren't standing on opposite sides. They were standing together. Not perfectly, not without a past, but together. The music ended, but no one rushed to leave. Sometimes the most important moment isn't a loud event, but a quiet realization. Everything is finally in its right place. Not because it became perfect, but because it became honest. Later, as the hall thinned out, I stepped outside into the warm evening air. It was the same air, but I was different now. Ethan followed me out. "So is this officially the end of the story?" I smiled. "No. Now it's just life." He nodded. "Sounds harder." "It is." I took his hand. "But at least it's real." As we were leaving, my grandfather lingered by the exit, looking back at the hall, the tables, and the lights. Then he said, "It got better." I smiled. We tried. He nodded. I can see that. And in that moment, I finally understood the meaning of the words he had repeated his whole life. Leave everything better than you found it. Not perfect, not pretty for other people's eyes. Just honest, as much as you possibly can. And if people can breathe a little easier after you leave, then you've done enough. And maybe that is the real ending. Not when everything comes to a close, but when you're no longer afraid to be the one who flips the table. If that's what it takes to put everything where it truly belongs.